Why is NASA uncomfortable with SpaceX launching the Starship from the Florida launch site? Even though SpaceX owes NASA to launch its astronauts on the moon, NASA may not want SpaceX to take some decisions that may dent its image, which is why NASA may be against SpaceX launching a Starship in Florida. What's the very important scenario that may have triggered NASA to stand and oppose SpaceX, this time haven't escaped a hell of delay in the hands of the FAA? Stay till the end of this video. Let's have a deep discussion about the recent strange NASA move against SpaceX. Early this year, NASA raised concerns about the risks of SpaceX's plans to launch its next-generation Starship rocket from the only pad that Dragon could use. In response, SpaceX looked into possibly making changes to its Cape Canaveral Space Force Station LC-40 pad for Dragon missions. 3 months later, the partners have agreed to this plan, and SpaceX says that hardware is already being made to make the necessary changes. But this reconstruction won't serve a good taste for NASA. After a false start in 2019 and 2020, no thanks to the pandemic and the FAA, that served as a major nightmare is SpaceX operations, and it appears that SpaceX moved from the den of the FAA to that of SpaceX, but trust the company won't be battling with frustration forever. This year, SpaceX began quickly building Starship's first launch site in Florida on the LC-39A pad it rents from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Pad 39A is the only spot to launch Crew and Cargo Dragon spacecraft and Falcon 9 rockets. This is because several changes and renovations were made to the existing space shuttle structure. Starship was 1,000 feet east of 39A's existing Falcon and Dragon launch facilities and access tower. During normal operations, it probably won't have much of an effect, but the program has a history of making prototypes that sometimes explode. NASA's opinion about SpaceX's recent relocation to Florida is that if SpaceX launches its Starship rocket in Florida, and unfortunately there happens to be any crash, the result could damage the space agency's Pad 39A launch pad. NASA wants SpaceX to ensure that the Starship rocket launch pad will not risk important property. The FAA has already limited SpaceX's success by making the company follow rules that aren't necessary. Having too many rules and regulations stops the innovation, and in the long run, it slows the progress of civilization. This has obviously had a huge impact on SpaceX Starship processes. First, the FAA took almost a year to decide whether or not to launch Starship. Now, the FAA had given SpaceX a narrow pass approval when the launch plan passed a critical environmental review in June, but there are 75 required wired changes to the mission profile that must be made before the license is handed over. Elon Musk decided earlier this year to build another launch pad in Florida to solve this problem, and here in Florida, NASA is becoming a bottleneck, giving SpaceX another round of headaches. NASA is worried that if the huge untested rocket fails, it could destroy the only launch pad on Earth that can send astronauts to the ISS. To avoid this risk, Bill Gertson, mayor of SpaceX, said in a flight readiness review for Crew 5 on September 26th that SpaceX has already started building the infrastructure needed to launch crews from SLC-40 at Cape Canaveral in Florida. He also says that this will start the cargo launches from SLC-40 and then move on to the crew launches. Everything will be ready for Starship. SpaceX's Crew Dragon is the only spacecraft that can support NASA's presence in space until at least late 2023. It can carry a crew of 4 to 5 astronauts to the International Space Station. Boeing's Starliner crew capsule is years behind schedule and won't try its first crew test until at least February 2023. The first mission to move astronauts with Starliner could happen in September 2023, but if the CTF isn't perfect, it could easily be pushed back to 2024. So far, Starliner's test flights without a crew have found major problems that have taken months to fix. When a Falcon 9 rocket exploded at LC-40 in 2016, the damage was so bad that the pad had to be rebuilt from scratch. It took SpaceX 15 months to bring the pad back to life. In other words, if a Starship launch fails in the next 12 to 18 months and Pad 39A's Falcon and Dragon facilities are destroyed, NASA's ability to keep the ISS running could be in danger if Boeing doesn't come up with an alternative. NASA spent about $750 million on the SLS tower plus $380 million on a new crawler to move it to the launch pad. SpaceX uses self-propelled modular transporters, 20-wheeled platforms that can be bought on the open market for maybe a couple of $1 million each huge. They must have at least 4 of them. Want it done fast? SpaceX. But why would SpaceX destroy it? Who cares if the company can make another version that's better and cheaper? What matters is that NASA won't be able to test space flights in 2023 as planned. If it's like the tower they built for Starship, it shouldn't take too long to build. Let's say 6 months for building and testing. The only real problem is whether or not they have enough people with enough skill to get it done quickly enough. For example, the tower section is thought to come with at least some of the plumbing already installed, so all that needs to be done is connect the pieces instead of bringing a lot of pipes to the top. Unfortunately, it's heartbreaking news to know that NASA is not in the same understanding as SpaceX when building another launch pad. NASA is not ready to buy the idea of launching the Starship in Florida if it has not successfully been launched at Boca Chica, Texas. Everything is confirmed to be working perfectly without damage. The idea is NASA wants SpaceX to launch the Starship in Florida if only the Starship will be launched successfully without crashing to keep the Pad 39A from subsequent damages. And remember, SpaceX could launch several Starships per day in Florida, which poses slight changes for Pad 39A to survive damages. They need a new facility to keep up with the number of launches. Launching 100 Starships a year needs to be done quickly if everything goes well. Even with a lot of launches from VAB, a 6-day turnaround time is not good enough. Suppose the other heavy launch vehicles keep getting stuck. In that case, they might have to launch Dream Chaser, Reef and everything else made for those other systems. Even though SpaceX would never launch Starship from Pad 39A if there was a high chance that the new rocket would fail and hurt Dragon operations, NASA's job is to make sure that backup plans are in place in case something unlikely but bad happens. It doesn't matter if Starship probably won't blow up or if Starliner will probably be ready to take over. There is always a chance of something going wrong, and both SpaceX and NASA need to be ready for that. No one knows what changes will need to be made to LT-40, but it's more likely that NASA will tell SpaceX to build something like the facilities at Pad 39A. To do that, a new crew access tower, crew access arm, escape system, and bunker for astronauts would have to be built. Since NASA is mostly behind the need for a backup Dragon launch pad, the agency will likely make SpaceX wait until the backup is ready before letting them launch Starship from Pad 39A. CEO Elon Musk changed when he thought the first Florida Starship would take off from late 2022 to the second quarter of 2023. SpaceX is very unlikely to be able to finish making changes to LT-40 by the second quarter of 2023. SpaceX will have to do the already difficult and time-sensitive construction project on a high-security military base close to the world's busiest launch pad. A lot of the custom hardware that might be needed could take a long time to make, adding even more time to the building process. Unless SpaceX is willing to seriously limit how often LT-40 launches, which would probably make its goals of more than 60 launches in 2022 and up to 100 launches of the Falcon in 2023 possible, the work will take even longer than it normally would. Why didn't NASA see that there might be a problem and give them a different launch pad where a possible explosion wouldn't be a problem? They didn't think, so now SpaceX is in trouble. It seems like this kind of thing is happening more and more. Since the Starship tests have ended in disaster, it's not surprising that NASA is telling them to make sure their equipment works so they don't blow up our launch pad. How do you think SpaceX will go about now launching Starship in Florida? In the middle of all this confusion, SpaceX has revealed a new launch date for Starship's first payload. Just click on the video to know more about this.